Did Chuck and Jimmy's relationship crash and burn because Chuck was right about Jimmy, or because he was wrong about him? My 3-part series has been a deep dive into that very question as I examine the rise and fall of the McGill brothers, a fascinating relationship with several compelling and complicated layers. By looking at Chuck's journey scene by scene, I've been trying to understand what most drove that resentment and how it pushed both him and Jimmy to where they ultimately end up. Season 1 set up the tension, Season 2 turned up the heat, and in Season 3, everything comes to a head with a devastatingly explosive conclusion. Jimmy and Chuck's pride, lies, and hurt collide, and with the final, extremely fiery scenes at the end of Season 3, it seems there will be no coming back from what's been done. So here are my 114 insights about the brothers McGill in Season 3 and beyond, as we finally get to the bottom of what really destroyed Chuck and Jimmy McGill.
Don't think I'll ever forget what happened here today.
Season 3 is a fascinating and tragic arc, and this season really makes a case for why Chuck is one of TV's most interesting and complicated antagonists. He's villainous not in the twirling mustache way, but in the psychologically broken way. Season 3's premiere brings us back to the last scene between Chuck and Jimmy in Season 2. I like how it starts with just a shot of the silver compact miler sheets hanging, as we can only hear Jimmy and Chuck's Season 2 conversation without seeing them. Until Jimmy bursts through the space curtains, it feels like we're placed in the position of the tape recorder, under the space blanket material and listening in on Jimmy's confession. When Jimmy comes back into the house, Chuck is swiftly removing the ruse of the space blankets from his walls since he got the confession he wanted, so the act is over. And for a moment, the two almost seem like they're back to their certain brother dynamic, as Chuck shows Jimmy how to remove the foil without taking off the varnish, a method Jimmy will later apply to tape in his office too, showing his big brother's lessons do stick sometimes. Jimmy gets distracted by a book he sees on the shelf, The Adventures of Mabel. It's a book Chuck read to Jimmy as a child, and it carries extra significance due to the author, Harry Thurston Peck. Peck experienced success, but then had his reputation ruined by scandal and lost his employment, later going on to take his own life, like Chuck. Jimmy thinks they're going to go fondly down memory lane when Chuck recalls Jimmy's beloved Daffy Duck nightlight that got so hot they feared it would burn the house down. More foreshadowing. And Jimmy compliments Chuck for having a great memory. I noticed Jimmy is way less hesitant to give Chuck his props for his smarts and strengths than Chuck is to give Jimmy his props. But then when Jimmy is trying to bring up a girl who lived nearby that he liked, who apparently was always dirty, Chuck's energy shifts. And I think it's because it feels like this is yet again a moment of Jimmy thinking he's gotten away with something scot-free. So instead, Chuck reminds Jimmy he will never forget what happened here today, and Jimmy will pay for what he confessed to. In the scene where Chuck plays the tape for Howard, Howard sits at a desk in Chuck's home as Chuck sits across from him, almost like he's going before a judge to present his case. While legal, Chuck did some unethical and deceptive things. He pretended to quit the law to Howard and exacerbated his condition to manipulate Jimmy into coming to his home and confessing. He recorded Jimmy without his consent. And knowing the tape can't be used as evidence, he intends for the tape to be used as bait. Again, he doesn't consider how, yes, Jimmy will act rashly to these traps Chuck sets, but also, Jimmy is being set up to act rashly. Jimmy certainly knows how to misbehave all on his own, but Chuck is also actively puppeteering scenarios for Jimmy to misbehave, showing he too is responsible for how things play out. Chuck can't change the tape recorder's batteries himself, so he asks Ernie to do it, and when the tape starts playing, Chuck flips out and tells Ernie he didn't hear it, and then uses his knowledge of the law to essentially threaten Ernie into not telling anyone. Chuck's approach here is menacing and insincere, despite his claim that Ernie must remain silent out of a legally upright, noble obligation. Chuck hates that Jimmy uses his lawyer skills to manipulate for personal gain, but he does it too. So it's not that Chuck always does the moral thing, it's that Chuck thinks whatever he does can be labeled as moral.
For this, you destroyed our family?
Chuck tells Howard he's sure his plan will work because he knows his brother. And then, sure enough, the second after he says that, Jimmy comes barging over, banging on the door and acting a fool. And again, Chuck knowing his brother and how to trigger him is what sparked this and created this behavior. Jimmy breaks the door in, screams at Chuck, and pulls a low blow saying no wonder his wife left him. And then he destroys the tape. Jimmy asks if he made copies and says,
"Tell me or I'll burn this whole goddamn house to the ground!"
Lots of burning down the house foreshadowing, and in a way, Jimmy does contribute to Chuck burning down the house at the end of the season. Then Chuck gets the moment he's been waiting for pretty much all his life, when Howard and the private investigator walk out and declare being a witness to Jimmy's crash out. Chuck gets to feel like finally people see what he sees in his little brother, overlooking how his influence also played a part in this.
You have to make a change before it's too late.
Now in a much different position than when they sat side by side on the bench in season 1, Chuck steps outside and lords over Jimmy as he tells him that he's trying to help and he'll be pressing charges because Jimmy needs to face consequences. This connects to how Chuck regrets bailing Jimmy out in Chicago and helping him evade the consequences he believes are necessary. Without their mom around to say otherwise, Chuck can now do what he wanted to do back then. Chuck says he has to believe Jimmy will face the consequences and come out a better man. But Jimmy was starting to become a better man when he worked in the mailroom and got his law degree. However, Chuck believes that was too easy for Jimmy. He didn't want Jimmy to get better through help, but through hardship, as he thinks it's only through consequences that you can really be refined when you're a sinful person like Jimmy. Chuck says Jimmy needs to course correct before he destroys himself, and Chuck needed to take his own advice, because he stays on such a stringent course that will eventually lead him to literally destroy himself by the end of the season. They close up on Jimmy making a face when Chuck says, "I believe you can change." Chuck absolutely does not believe that, and Jimmy knows that now. Those lies Chuck used to spew are now mere empty words to Jimmy. Chuck says Jimmy will find his path, and when he's ready, he'll be there to help Jimmy walk that path. But Jimmy did find his path with the law, it just happened to be one Chuck resented. It makes you wonder if Jimmy had chosen a path that was equally prestigious and upstanding, but not the same as Chuck in law, would Chuck have been at least a little more supportive? Like, if Jimmy chose to turn his life around as a thriving scientist and not a lawyer, would Chuck have been as offended by his growth? I think he would still be against it for the most part, even if a little less averse. Someone like Jimmy should only be able to thrive under a confined ceiling to Chuck. But then Jimmy decides to take a much more blunt approach as he says, "Here's what's gonna happen. One day you're gonna get sick, again. One of your employees is gonna find you curled up in that space blanket, take you to the hospital, hook you up to those machines that beep and whir and hurt, and this time it'll be too much.
And you will die there. Alone."
I find it interesting how Jimmy said something awful to Chuck here, even suggesting it'll be an employee, not a family or friend, who finds Chuck in this vulnerable state. But it's Chuck's words later in the series that feel worse to me. Perhaps because Jimmy speaks from a place of raw hurt when he's being cruel, whereas Chuck speaks from a bitter, holier-than-thou place when he's being cruel, and Jimmy gets his prediction mostly right as Chuck sadly dies alone. Both brothers played their most dominant trump card in this exchange. Chuck took the righteous but insincere, "my morally superior self will help you get on the track I deem fit for you" approach, and Jimmy took the "your sickness is going to make you so vulnerable in need of help that will never arrive without me" approach. Chuck pretends to have a sincere moment when he tells the lawyer who visits his home, "Jimmy has a good heart. It's not an excuse for what he's done, but he's my brother, and when he's emotional,
He flies off the handle.
even though again, Chuck often created scenarios to intentionally make Jimmy over-emotional. But then Chuck suggests there may be a better consequence for Jimmy, which is the solution he's always wanted from the start, forcing Jimmy to no longer be a lawyer. And that shows that Chuck's whole empathy for Jimmy thing was an act. Almost like whenever he tells someone that Jimmy has a good heart, it's just an act to get them on his own side and get one step closer to getting Jimmy out of the legal field where he's convinced he does not belong.
And no one should treat his own brother like that.
During the pre-prosecution diversion meeting with Kim, Howard, Chuck, and Jimmy, the mediating lawyer treats Jimmy like she's his mother, making him say sorry to his brother. Chuck and Jimmy often find themselves in these situations where people become like the stand-ins for their parents and unresolved parent issues. It makes it feel like since they'll never be able to settle this unspoken competition with their parents, they'll never be able to settle things with each other, and forever they'll just seek people to validate them the way their parents no longer can. Then, after the meeting, Chuck is so prideful that when Kim calls him out about making a duplicate tape and Howard tries to evade the accusation, Chuck confirms and says actually Jimmy destroyed the duplicate, and the original is under lock and key. That info helps Kim and Jimmy with the hearing, and it further shows just how much Chuck was calculated in the trap he set for Jimmy.
But not our Jimmy. Couldn't be precious Jimmy.
The first episode that always comes to mind to me whenever I think of Chuck McGill is this masterpiece, Chicanery. So there's a whole lot to dive into within this particular excellent episode. The episode opens with another long and important flashback teaser where Chuck tries to hide his EHS to convince Rebecca that he's been perfectly fine since their divorce. It was interesting to me that Better Call Saul is often so intentional about their opening images for an episode. And for this important episode, it opens with grass being cut outside of Chuck's home. It made me reflect on one of Jimmy and Chuck's most brotherly moments when they sat outside together for the first time in years and just enjoyed putting their feet in the grass. But the grass being cut feels like whatever little bits of brotherly love was there between Chuck and Jimmy, in Season 1 is about to be cut apart too. More deliberately though, the grass being cut is yet another indicator of Chuck being willing to be around electricity in the past, although in this case his allergy has kicked in already and he's only allowing this electricity around his home to fool Rebecca. It's also interesting to me that the first thing they show once Jimmy enters the home is the oven or microwave being installed, as Chuck wouldn't want Rebecca to think it's odd he doesn't have one. Even though he tells the men not to actually hook up the appliances so they don't work, they just look like they do. Kinda like himself. It seems like a moment of Chuck genuinely wanting Jimmy's opinion when he asks if he should wear his wedding ring or not for dinner. This whole moment is a time of Chuck really needing Jimmy's help. And Jimmy is the one taking a bit of a moral stance here as he questions if Chuck is sure about trying to tell such a big lie. Although I think it's more the extent of the lie than the lying itself that Jimmy is hesitant about, as he's never above employing some deception. But Chuck's ego won't allow him to let Rebecca see what he's really been dealing with. And it again shows how Chuck is willing to bend his morals when it suits him, similar to Jimmy. Chuck and Jimmy both weaponize the law and justify their deception. Chuck and Jimmy sort of have a Slippin' Jimmy and Marco act as they try to sell a story to Rebecca about the power going out, in order to explain why he's in the dark with all these candles. And it's a nice touch to have the story be about the electric company mixing up addresses 512 and 215. The brothers McGill really are no stranger to spinning a tale with falsely fudged numbers. Chuck hated that Jimmy did it to him, even though he too lied about number mix-ups in the past. At the dinner table, it's interesting that when Rebecca says she can't believe Jimmy is a lawyer now, Chuck says, "Neither can I." And you can tell he means it in more of a "I can't believe this joke" way, and Rebecca means it as a proud thing that Jimmy has become a responsible citizen. Then they really make Rebecca being on her cell phone feel like a horror film for Chuck, culminating in Chuck tossing Rebecca's phone while she's on the call. Rebecca asks, "What is your problem?" And Chuck does have a problem, but instead of coming clean, he takes the self-righteous route, telling Rebecca it's incredibly bad manners to be on the phone with company around. As if throwing someone's phone out of their hands isn't worse manners. But that's Chuck for you. He'd rather chastise someone than come clean about his own vulnerabilities. Jimmy says, "If you won't tell her, then I will," and that ends up being true later in this episode. Except now, Jimmy tells Rebecca about Chuck's illness to bring about Chuck's demise. The flashback serves to show that Jimmy knew how extremely important it was to Chuck that Rebecca never know about his weakness, which is why it's the ultimate trump card later in the episode. They emphasize the worrying exit sign at both the beginning of this hearing and the end, and there are so many scenes that show how willing people are to accommodate Chuck's allergy, making it all the more humiliating when Jimmy exposes the sensitivity as all in his head. Chuck is adamant that Jimmy deserves disbarment and not just a slap on the wrist like he usually gets. And in many ways, Jimmy actually does deserve that. But the reason Chuck still feels so wrong is because he wants Jimmy disbarred because of his own personal disdain over Jimmy being his peer, not just because of Jimmy's Mesa Verde tampering. Chuck says, "There's only one way forward. Let justice be done though the heavens fall." It's a legal phrase that means justice must be served regardless of the consequences, even if it leads to chaos or severe upheaval. And this iconic hearing will lead to exactly that, chaos and severe upheaval. Kim says, "But there's another side to this story, about two brothers whose relationship, after years of strain,
Finally broke.
Kim and Jimmy are the underdogs against Howard and Chuck, but the fact that Kim and Jimmy know that Jimmy did everything he's accused of makes what they're doing corrupt." I thought about why we root for Jimmy and Kim in this instance, despite knowing they are the ones lying and in the wrong. And I think it's because sometimes the people with heart feel more human and worth rooting for than just the person who's right. Chuck is right about what he's accusing Jimmy of in this case, but he's also so cold that he feels less human than the very flawed Jimmy, who certainly does bad things, but at least is moved by his care for people like Kim and Chuck, rather than being motivated strictly by pride. And that's another reason Jimmy becoming Saul is tragic, because Saul does become someone motivated not by care and companionship, but by money and pride. Similar to Jimmy in the bathroom in the pilot, Chuck rehearses what he's going to say in court, and he's trying to practice sounding empathetic and fond of his brother. He literally has to practice sounding sincere when saying he loves his brother, further demonstrating just how detached from genuine fondness Chuck really is. Chuck reiterates the law is too important, and it's true more than he knows. He made the law so important that it blinded him to what else matters in life, like family. The law is important, but Chuck made it too important. I also noticed they made it a point to show Jimmy and Kim walking into court perfectly side by side and having a warm moment before entering. Later, they show Chuck and Howard walking in the building and never quite in sync. I like how it reflects that Jimmy and Kim are a partnership that will grow tighter after this hearing, though in a toxic way, whereas Chuck and Howard are a partnership that will grow more distant after the hearing and eventually crumble. Seeing Jimmy and Chuck go toe-to-toe in this hearing is great. Chuck says, "I exaggerated the symptoms of my disease to extract the truth." basically saying, I lied, but it's okay because it was in the quest for truth. Like he once accused Jimmy, Chuck thinks the ends justify the means here. When speaking on Jimmy in court, Chuck says,
But what I know for sure is that the law is too important to be toyed with.
Chuck repeating the law is too important lets you know this is a rehearsed act like what he was rehearsing at home. Chuck says the way Jimmy treats the law breaks his heart because he cares about protecting mankind's greatest achievement, that no matter who you are, actions have consequences. He holds that sacred. And it's interesting that Chuck's emphasis is on the law's ability to bring about consequences more so than the law's ability to protect the victimized. It's like what Chuck loves most about the law is its ability to penalize more than protect. And especially after watching Jimmy get away with so much since childhood, Chuck appreciates that the law can punish unruly people like his brother. But ultimately, Chuck and Jimmy show that holding something too sacred and holding something too haphazardly are both problematic. Jimmy pulling the Rebecca card is below the belt, but also very smart because he knows it's one of Chuck's biggest vulnerabilities. And with his pride hit, Chuck will be off his game if Rebecca has to learn of his EHS. The part that always pulls my heartstrings in this episode is when Jimmy vulnerably asks Chuck,
How did you know it would work?
It's smart to ask, and sad too, because he's calling out Chuck for taking advantage not of Jimmy's temper or impulsivity, but taking advantage of how much he knows Jimmy truly cares about him and his wellness. Jimmy suggests that Chuck hates him, and I thought about if I think that's true. At the root of most hate is hurt. I think Chuck initially was hurt by Jimmy, even right from birth, because even in Chuck's letter that Jimmy reads after Chuck dies, Chuck wrote how he'd never seen his mother happier than the day Jimmy was born. I think since a young age, Chuck internalized that Jimmy wasn't just lovable, but more loved than him. It started with their parents and then more people who showed they just love Jimmy and are more drawn to him, even despite his imperfections. And the law was supposed to be a place where love and likability didn't matter, where rules created structure and breaking them created consequences. Chuck found his sense of self in that seemingly organized world. But then Jimmy joins the law and proves that even within the law, things can be broken, murky, corrupt, and imperfect. In the legal field, it's actually not as simple as whoever is right wins. It's whoever is the most persuasive. And who's more persuasive than Jimmy McGill? Which means even in law, slipping Jimmy can thrive. Jimmy becoming a lawyer shatters the presumed purity of the law and thus the presumed purity of Chuck. And for that, I think Chuck did have hate for Jimmy. Chuck loved his brother deep down, but his hate for him was louder. Chuck says Rebecca was lured by concern for him, but so was Jimmy when he came over and made his confession. Chuck also recalls the flashback scene where he went to great lengths to conceal his illness. He thinks Rebecca showing up is Jimmy's only trick up his sleeve, when really Jimmy's biggest trick is up in Chuck's breast pocket. Chuck is so patronizing when he asks Jimmy if he's answered his questions to his satisfaction. It's like he's talking to Jimmy as a kid and shows how much he doesn't view him as a legitimate lawyer. But Jimmy sets Chuck up perfectly by making him explain that the further away the electricity is, the less effect it has. Then Jimmy pulls some true Saul Goodman tactics by having Chuck find the battery he had Huel plant right in his pocket for over an hour and 43 minutes. Then, of course, there's the great final monologue from Chuck, where all his years-long pent-up frustrations erupt. The monologue fittingly begins with Chuck screaming,
I am not crazy!
For so long, Chuck's greatest asset was his sharp legal mind, so it makes him irate that people may now think he's crazy. But Chuck really goes mask off in this scene in court and exposes his disdain for Jimmy. Chuck regrets saving Jimmy, failing to see that the way he saved him, putting him on a restrictive leash, actually contributed to destroying him. It's really interesting how they film this scene like Chuck is the only one in the room, screaming into the void because that's how he's felt for so long, like no one around is listening. Chuck says,
He'll never change, ever since he was 9, always the same.
Chuck makes it so personal as he brings up childhood and precious Jimmy and how no one believed his brother was corrupt except him. Whenever he bashes Jimmy, he takes it back to childhood, showing there are certainly many unhealed childhood wounds in him.
And he gets to be a lawyer? What a sick joke! I should have stopped him when I had the chance. And you have to stop him.
It really is giving when a villain's true motives are revealed. Chuck comes back to the present moment after going mask off and tries to collect himself, saying he got carried away. Then, less patronizingly this time, he asks if Jimmy has anything else. But Chuck's outburst already said it all. The episode ends with Chuck staring up at the red exit sign, though his real weaknesses and vulnerabilities are far from being electrical. And I like how this ending is similar to the ending of the scene that led to Chuck's spiral during the Mesa Verde meeting. It's almost like Chuck is forced to confront that fateful day in this moment, as both then and now, Chuck got bested by Jimmy.
It's just a name.
Chicanery began with Jimmy and Kim getting ready and supporting each other while the prosecution spoke in voiceover. Then the next episode begins with Kim speaking voiceover at the hearing as Chuck and his ex-partner have a much different, sadder experience. Rebecca tries to visit Chuck in his home, but Chuck hides away, humiliated and distraught. It's interesting that when Howard visits Chuck, Chuck sits at his desk in the dark, not his couch or his bed, but his desk, as that professional setting is like the only place he feels aligned. And I noticed Chuck's home sometimes feels like both a lonely cave and a dark villain's lair. One of the only positive things that seems to have come out of the hearing is that Jimmy's battery stunt led Chuck to try and hold a battery in his hand at his home, beginning the process of potentially overcoming his illness. Then I like how they make the lights look extra bright as Chuck goes to a phone booth. And Chuck shows some mental fortitude by making the call to Dr. Cruz. It seems he's finally ready to make a change. And so is Jimmy, as this is the episode where he more publicly embraces his Saul Goodman persona and introduces him to Kim at the end of the episode. It's fitting that the more official introduction of Saul Goodman appears in the episode after Chuck and Jimmy do major damage to what was left of their brotherhood. From the ashes of their dysfunctional brotherhood, the Saul identity was born.
I don't want him to get in trouble with you guys because of me.
Jimmy says,
I'm extremely lovable.
in the scene where he does the least likable thing he's ever done so far. Jimmy is shedding real tears at this insurance company in episode 7 and mixing lies with truth, but with an insincere and pretty cruel agenda to expose his brother's illness to the insurance company. Jimmy isn't just a good guy turned bad, similar to how I feel Walter White is not just a good guy turned bad. Both men had a prideful master manipulator in them all along, and Jimmy has always known how to weaponize his words and personality. You know Jimmy is being insincere in all this when he still suggests Chuck is mixing up numbers on important documents when really that was his doing. Jimmy says it's just going to destroy him, and it's very ironic for Jimmy to say that as he actively works to destroy Chuck in this meeting. And Jimmy is more correct in that assessment than he could ever guess. I feel like we really see Saul when Jimmy walks out of that insurance meeting with a smirk for sticking it to Chuck. I view this as one of the most off-putting things Jimmy did because Jimmy's signature heart is absent, and this just feels heartless. I get that Jimmy has been pretty down and out with work and finances thanks to not being able to practice law for a year, but this was a pretty cruel way to make Chuck pay. These McGill brothers are determined to make the other pay for their actions.
What if it's all in my head?
Jimmy recalls his father's goodness with much more resentment in this episode 8 flashback, telling Marco that his family worked hard and worked a lot of years for nothing. He believes everybody liked his dad because he was a soft touch. Much different than how Chuck fondly remembered the neighborhood loving their dad for his goodness, not his naivete. Jimmy says every deadbeat owed their dad money, which again points to the fact that that might be where some of the $14K went. Jimmy also says his dad was never going to do what he had to do, even if it was immoral like sell beers and cigarettes to kids. And Jimmy learned a twisted lesson that to make it in life, you do whatever you have to do, even if it's frowned upon or illegal. Jimmy came to hate the idea of working nobly for no reward and getting walked all over. Observing the grifters no longer made him want to go in the other direction, it made him want to do what he had to do to ensure he was a wolf in this world too. If there's only wolves and sheep in the world, then it was never going to be easy for Jimmy to decide to stop being a wolf if the only other option is to be a sheep. Like Chuck, he neglected that there's something in between that one could be, someone who doesn't get walked all over like his father without becoming the person who does the walking over. Then, Chuck is so happy about the strides he's made in his meeting with Dr. Cruz. This scene becomes tragic in retrospect when he describes how he sees his future, which includes being back to work full-time with no accommodations, wanting his house to be full of music, and having a big, huge celebration where he gets to be surrounded by friends and colleagues. And he will get that outcome, but in a much sadder way. He'll be surrounded by friends and colleagues when HHM celebrates his forced retirement, and he'll play music in a home alone when Jimmy visits him one last time for their coldest conversation yet. Chuck learns a lesson, but not the right lesson, because he's recovering, but he also wants to speed up the recovery rather than learn to enjoy the baby steps. It's still important to him that even his recovery is held to a standard of excellence. He often accuses Jimmy of shortcuts, but Chuck seems eager to fast forward through his recovery whether he's fully healed or not. It's a powerful moment when Chuck says his illness feels so real to him, but asks,
What if it's not?
and that if his condition is not real,
Then what have I done?
accepting his condition as not real would mean accepting that maybe his mind isn't all-knowing or immune to mental illness. It would mean having to face the fact that there were years he wasted cooped up inside with an imagined condition. This scene is a brief moment of accountability from Chuck. It's also like he's wondering if he could be wrong about this, then what else could he have been wrong about?
You want me to retire over this? The insurance?
In episode 9, Howard suggests retirement to Chuck and says sincerely,
Chuck, there's more to life than this.
and Chuck says
And I
he doesn't
don't
appreciate the suggestion. He's saying that about the suggestion to retire, but it also feels like Chuck doesn't appreciate the suggestion that there's more to life than the law. For Chuck, especially now after all the bridges he's burned, there isn't much more to life than his prestigious career. Chuck went from yelling, "I'm going to get better," to Jimmy during his first appearance in the show, to now yelling at Howard,
I'm better.
but it's too late. Howard knows, like we all know.
This is not what fine looks like.
Later, Howard calls Chuck out for suing HHM, and Chuck lets his pride all the way out, saying this is his firm and he built it, not Howard's dad or Howard. He's no longer pretending to be the guy who humbly says,
I helped.
Howard says, "You'd rather tear HHM down than retire?" And Chuck proceeds to turn on the last person left in his corner, Howard, and treats him like an opponent, not a friend, saying,
You think I'm trouble now? As your partner? Imagine me as your enemy.
the power trip is crazy. And the second Howard leaves, Chuck reacts negatively to the electricity and shows that his condition is still affecting him. It's really like all this time it was his pride that made him sick.
You're just gonna keep hurting people?
That's not true.
Jimmy, this is what you do.
The season 3 finale is equally powerful and devastating. It begins with a childhood flashback as a young Chuck reads The Adventures of Mabel to little Jimmy in a tent. Jimmy is concerned for Mabel and wants her to be okay, while Chuck sounds slightly annoyed by Jimmy's caring interruption as he assures Jimmy that she'll be okay. It captures how Chuck did spend quality time with Jimmy, but still in an aloof way. Where the author of The Adventures of Mabel is similar to Chuck in some ways, both scorned by scandal and ending their own lives, the character in the book seems to be similar to Jimmy. The excerpt Chuck reads is about a poor thing losing their way and stumbling, which I think alludes to Jimmy. And then they zoom in on the lantern in the tent, as that item will be quite impactful to the end of Chuck's story. Sometimes what will be the death of someone is there all along, and in this case it almost feels like that applies to two things in this tent, the lantern and Jimmy. When Chuck is at HHM, they film it so that the partners feel so far from him and like he's on trial against them. As they zoom away from Chuck, it yet again makes him feel like he's all alone, like in Chicanery. Chuck says, "I spent decades building this firm. I don't want to be the agent of its destruction." And even then, this is not because he deeply cares about the people of HHM, but because he doesn't want something he built to fall. Chuck really did lean into his villain bag by the end. Like, don't get me wrong, Gus Fring, Don Hector, Lalo, Todd, and his uncle are all great dastardly villains in the Breaking Bad universe. But something about Chuck believing he's successfully hiding his villainy behind morality is so sinister. I think the reason a quote-unquote good man like Chuck ended up being one of the most reprehensible in the series also has to do with how Chuck so often emphasized the superiority more than the moral in moral superiority. Howard asked the lawyers to give them the room, the same thing he said to Jimmy when he rejected him after passing the bar and rejected him working for HHM on the Sandpiper case, so you know bad news is coming. When Howard gives Chuck the $3 million check, the first of 3 to cash Chuck out, he tells Chuck,
You won.
but it's clear Chuck lost in every way that matters. I like the shot of Chuck on the balcony of HHM, residing over all his friends and colleagues as he looks at the kingdom he is no longer a king of. It's a big contrast from when he first entered HHM in season 1, not in terms of the applause, which is similar, but in the context, as Chuck is applauded during what he knows is a walk of shame out of HHM abruptly for good. And it's striking how when Chuck leaves HHM for the last time, he's engulfed in the brightness of the sun once he steps outside. It should be like heading into brighter days or a new beginning, when really it foreshadows a very dark end, where he'll be engulfed in light more detrimentally. It's almost like seeing him go to the light as his death is near. Jimmy essentially does a wellness check on Chuck after his forced retirement. Even after everything, Jimmy still cares to check on him. And when Chuck lets him inside, Jimmy is surprised to see all the electricity in his home. I really like the detail of him opening the full fridge and looking around. In the pilot, one of the first things Jimmy did is put food in the cooler since Chuck uses a cooler instead of an electricity-charged refrigerator. And then the last time Jimmy will ever enter Chuck's home, one of the first things Jimmy does is open the fridge, similar to his actions in their first scene together. This also feels like Chuck is running a similar ruse to the one he had Jimmy help him pull when Rebecca last visited. Both times, Chuck brought appliances back into his home and aimed to make someone think he was more healed than he was. Both times, he was playing pretend. I like the framing of Jimmy and Chuck starting their conversation so far away from each other. It visualizes the figurative distance that also exists between them. It's ironic for Chuck to say he said he'd get better, but Jimmy never believed him, when really it's Chuck who never believed Jimmy could get better. While Jimmy has some sincerity with Chuck here, the fact that he never just outright owns the truth of what he did with those documents makes it still pretty shady. Yes, he confessed it on the tape, but he left room for reasonable doubt and proceeded from then on to present his confession as a lie. So he really never just formally fesses up to Chuck. Chuck questions why Jimmy has regrets, something that will come up again in the series finale. Then Chuck says,
In the end, you're going to hurt everyone around you. You can't help it. So stop apologizing and accept it. Embrace it. Frankly, I'd have more respect for you if you did.
It really is like Chuck is giving some devil-on-the-shoulder speech to cement Jimmy's trajectory as the remorseless Saul Goodman. Jimmy always wanted Chuck's respect, and it's like Chuck is insincerely saying, you could get my respect more if you just embrace how bad you are. And not even because it would be more honest, but because at least Chuck would relish being right if Jimmy just owned his slipping Jimmy identity. Chuck says,
we don't have to understand each other.
But the true problem was that Chuck thought he did understand exactly who Jimmy is, when there's a lot more to Jimmy that he refused to see, understand, or accept. Then the Worst Thing Ever Said award goes to...
I don't want to hurt your feelings. But the truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me.
Such painful final words from Jimmy's last remaining family member, and someone who, in his own twisted ways, he really did care about. I think this statement from Chuck put Jimmy down a dark Saul path more than anything else. The one person Jimmy most wanted to make proud basically told him, you will never be the person I can be proud of, or even you can be proud of, so just give up and give in to your worst impulses. And if Jimmy never mattered to his brother, then it's like Jimmy's left to wonder why should anything matter anymore, especially being a law-abiding citizen. With Chuck's discouragement and haunting final words, Jimmy stopped believing he could be different, and if Jimmy couldn't be different, then he decided he'd just be more of what he already was, as slipping Jimmy evolved into the more powerful and corrupt Saul Goodman. And deep down, Chuck did not mean these awful words about Jimmy never mattering much to him. While I think Chuck may have never liked Jimmy, he loved him to some degree. Even if at the youngest age, reading The Adventures of Mabel to Jimmy in the tent, his little brother mattered to him in some capacity. Even when it seemed he hated Jimmy, he still mattered to him, just in a negative way. But at this point, Chuck's been so hurt over the years, so resentful and bitter, and his wounded pride has swollen to such epic proportions that Chuck was content making Jimmy think not even that he hated him, which at least is an emotion, that he was essentially always indifferent to Jimmy, as if Jimmy was meaningless to him. Chuck proved you don't have to be a criminal to be absolutely cruel. I like how McKean plays this heartbreaking moment, as it's clear Chuck is speaking from a place of anger and pride, but also hurt and exasperation. He tried to take down Jimmy and get the world to see his side, and he'd finally accepted it'll never work. Jimmy's gonna keep being him and keep coming out on top, so this is Chuck essentially throwing in the towel. The McGill brothers have a way of wanting to pull the other down with them. Jimmy was struggling after not practicing law thanks to Chuck, so he wanted to put Chuck in a position where he also was struggling from the insurance issue. Chuck felt like everything that once mattered to him had been taken away, and he wanted Jimmy to also feel a similar sense of meaninglessness. But what makes Chuck's words especially cruel is, as Jimmy said in Chicanery, how he knew it would work. Chuck knew those words would be especially soul-crushing to Jimmy because Jimmy did care about Chuck. Jimmy did want Chuck's approval, not just as a lawyer, but as a man. And Chuck chose for their final moments to be him stripping Jimmy of ever receiving that approval from the one place he wanted it, leaving Jimmy to now go on an endless quest to gain that approval elsewhere. It's a sad parallel, as Chuck and Jimmy's final scene ends in the same way as their first scene began in the pilot, with Chuck sitting at his desk and Jimmy watching him be too preoccupied to really see him, even with the lights now on. Jimmy takes one last look at his brother at his desk, and it's like he knows one way or another that'll be the last time he ever sees Chuck. They were dead to each other in this moment. And Chuck almost looks like he knows it when he hears the door close and looks at the baby picture of him and Jimmy with an emotional expression that I interpret as regret. I also find it to be a compelling next shot when Chuck is in bed, and he sleeps so far on one end that you'd think there was another person in bed with him. But no, his bed, like his life, is empty. He's completely alone now, having pushed away everyone who genuinely cared about him. All this pretending catches up to Chuck, and he's made such a mess of his life. Yet rather than think this pain and restlessness is because of him and his prideful choices, he goes back to thinking the issue is the electricity. So he destroys his house and power meter to find the source of the issue when the issue was him. It suggests how the illness likely started this way too after the divorce. Like maybe Chuck felt so much disappointment when Rebecca left him and refused to believe he was the problem and decided EHS was the culprit. The wallpaper Chuck destroys reminds me of The Yellow Wallpaper, a famous short story about a woman who descends into psychosis and tears down the wallpaper, convinced that a woman is in the walls. And Chuck is similar, as he goes stark mad in the home that he turned into a prison and tears down the walls, convinced his issues must lie behind the walls and not within. Chuck has made his life a mess, and since his house has always externally reflected where Chuck's at internally, it's only fitting that the house becomes an utter mess too. Jimmy took some losses this episode as well, with shutting down the office he shares with Kim. He even walks out of the office with the same light blur that Chuck left HHM. But the biggest difference is that he has Kim by his side. He's not alone like Chuck, even though Jimmy is certainly still headed down a darker path going forward too. Correct. Jimmy and Kim also watched the classic lawyer movie To Kill a Mockingbird, And it's like Chuck is the mockingbird that gets killed by the end of the episode. Destruction of innocence is a theme in To Kill a Mockingbird, and Chuck, while guilty of being a callous brother, was actually innocent with the Mesa Verde mix-up. Yet the effects from that day and everything afterward have pushed a legally innocent Chuck toward destruction. Chuck is ready to destroy whatever is causing his problems, and when he finally realizes it's him as the source, he destroys himself. Chuck's final scene includes him alone in his destroyed home, surrounded by his space blanket, a symbol of his mental illness, and lots of books, a symbol of intellect, which is all he has left, as well as a lantern on a newspaper, a hazard that was often warned about in prior episodes. The Adventures of Mabel is also on the desk by the lantern. The book has become associated with Jimmy and Chuck's brotherhood, and Chuck knows that after what he last said to Jimmy, their brotherhood is officially disintegrated, so he burns the book with him. The book being on the desk could suggest that Chuck had been recalling that memory of reading the book to Jimmy as kids and regretting how deeply he hurt his baby brother. The book is a reminder that Jimmy did matter to Chuck at some point, but sadly, it seems Jimmy mattered to Chuck like a wounded wild animal to tame and tend to, not an equal or respected peer. Chuck has to repeatedly kick the lantern to get it to fall. The continued kicks show that he had time to rethink this decision, but his mind is made up. He's given way to his madness and is ready to end it all, officially powerless. Part of me has always wondered if Chuck also hated the idea of someone finding his house in this destroyed state, since his pride wouldn't want such a visual reflection of his mental disarray out there. So he wanted to burn it all down and hide his most vulnerable self one last time. Chuck finally burns down his prison/hell, but he also burns with it, ironically spending so much of life in the darkness and then ending it engulfed in bright flames. It's like Chuck's home and his mind were a prison he'd never escape, so instead, he turned his home into a tomb.
It's showtime.
Season 4 is the first season where Jimmy has to navigate life without Chuck. He's lost his brother and has a very unique way of grieving it. He aims to seem ready to move forward in life pretty quickly, because Chuck had already died to him in their final brutal conversation and also killed a huge piece of him as well. It's also interesting how Jimmy doesn't want therapy, just like Chuck didn't want the mental health help with his electricity allergy. While Jimmy runs from really confronting the depths of pain over the loss of his brother, Chuck's presence forever looms over Jimmy and the rest of the series. Chuck returns twice in Season 4, once during a flashback of Jimmy working in HHM's mailroom, and then most notably in the Season 4 finale. In a moving flashback from the Season 4 finale, Chuck is shown vouching for Jimmy when he's sworn in as a lawyer. And Chuck does call Jimmy brother when he vouches for him, but unlike some of the other lawyers, Chuck notably doesn't say it's his pleasure to vouch for Jimmy. That's sort of fitting for Chuck. He's the brother who would agree to vouch for Jimmy, but it wouldn't bring him pleasure. Then, this flashback at karaoke is one of the few genuinely brotherly moments between Chuck and Jimmy. But there are still signs of their issues. Chuck tries to leave Jimmy's celebration early, and then when Jimmy encourages him to duet with him, Chuck, who is the much better singer, takes over the song. That reflects them in life, with how Jimmy wanted them to do things together, but then Chuck takes over and cuts Jimmy out. Jimmy and Chuck lean on each other when they return to the apartment, and Jimmy is drunk and happy that the two McGill brothers are both lawyers. And Chuck helps Jimmy get into bed and seems nurturing. It's a great choice for Jimmy and Chuck to sing Winner Takes It All by ABBA, both at karaoke and before they go to sleep. It's like the lyrics reflect the mentality both brothers were blinded by. Who's going to win it all between us? And that competition became their undoing. And the last lyric they sing in the teaser is, "But I was a fool playing by the rules," which again is relatable to both of them. Chuck returns one last time in the Season 6 finale. It feels fitting that the last fully in color scene of the entire series is between Chuck and Jimmy. Because in watching a series about the making of the colorful Saul Goodman, Chuck had quite a hand in creating the Saul we know in Breaking Bad. He was pivotal to Jimmy's life and trajectory into Saul Goodman. Which is ironic because I think if Chuck were asked what the worst, most bastardized version of the law could look like, it would be Saul Goodman. And yet, Saul Goodman is partly his handiwork. And it's a seemingly mundane final memory to visit, as Jimmy just does a routine drop-off for Chuck at night, presumably taking place just before the pilot episode. But what makes this seemingly simple memory particularly meaningful and somber is that this memory is likely where Jimmy would go back to if he had a time machine. He'd ask other characters about where they'd go if they had a time machine, and as Walter so arrogantly corrected, the question really is about regrets. And then in the end, I think we get to see Jimmy's big regret, passing up on heart-to-hearts with Chuck and developing a better bond with his brother. Perhaps Jimmy thinks that if he had stayed to talk more, he and Chuck could have got a better understanding of each other and their path wouldn't have ended so tragically. During this visit, Chuck says Jimmy can stay and they can talk about his cases and clients. He seems to be sincerely wanting Jimmy's company. Jimmy dismisses his cases, but Chuck says they deserve a vigorous defense just like any other client. And when Jimmy becomes Saul and his clients become blatant criminals, well, He did take that advice and give them a vigorous defense just like any other client. Chuck says,
If you don't like where you're heading, there's no shame in going back and changing your path.
these words are great advice, but from Chuck, I do doubt their sincerity a bit. He believes people can't change. And notice he says there's no shame in going back. To me, that suggests he's not encouraging Jimmy to change his path to a higher or better one, but rather retreat back to the lowly places he feels Jimmy belongs. At this point, Chuck still wants Jimmy to change his path as a lawyer, and I feel like that's what he's most encouraging Jimmy to reconsider. Although it is interesting to see Chuck painted as actually caring in this scene. It again shows the power of perspective. Chuck could be viewed as manipulative in the scene, or he can be viewed as thoughtful, wanting to try and make an effort with his brother here. And that's part of what makes the scene so genius. It emphasizes one of the biggest concepts of the series, which is that perspective shapes everything, and there's more than one way to view things. But of course, Chuck speaking of change is a bit hypocritical as Jimmy responds,
When have you ever changed your path?
Chuck grimly says
We always end up having the same conversation, don't we?
before Jimmy leaves, and then Chuck grabs his lantern and a copy of H.G. Wells' Time Machine as he returns to the isolating cave that is his home. And again, I could see this being where Jimmy wishes he could go back in time and make it so they don't always end up having the same conversations that lead them further apart than closer. Their relationship was a cycle of hurting each other, and I think Jimmy feels maybe this night could have been the beginning of breaking that cycle had they just taken the time to more readily see each other. Plus, with Chuck having been the one reading the Time Machine book, this scene could suggest that the literature had put him in the mindset of what he'd want to change as well, and that he hoped maybe this night could have been a turning point for him and Jimmy too. That's the interesting thing with regrets, because it essentially is the feeling that maybe you could have changed your path for a better one. And that's one of the big looming life questions explored in this series. Can you change your path, or is your path predestined? Jimmy believed he could change his path at one point. He cleaned up his life in the mailroom, he got a law degree, he found $1 million class action lawsuit with Sandpiper. But then, Jimmy made the mistake of wanting his brother's love and approval so much that he tried to partner with Chuck on the case, only for everything to unravel and end in destruction. Because Chuck believed you can't change your path, and that rigid belief forever altered Jimmy's own path. But Jimmy does take Chuck's advice about changing his path at the very end. Once arrested, Jimmy yet again used his power of persuasion to greatly talk down his sentence. But he didn't like where he was heading by running forever from accountability, so instead of taking advantage of his long-standing ability to evade consequences, he changed his path and owned his crimes. And I feel that ended up being Jimmy's greatest act of defiance toward the belief that he can't change. Yes, he ended up where Chuck thought, a criminal in prison. So in that regard, Chuck was right, and Jimmy did finally face the consequences in the way Chuck was convinced he must. But also, Jimmy landed there with an 86-year prison sentence because he chose at the end of the day to not be Saul Goodman or Gene or Victor with a K or Kevin Costner. In his final moments, he chose to again be Jimmy McGill. Jimmy McGill changed his path in the end because people can in fact change. After deep diving into Jimmy and Chuck's brotherhood in 3 parts, I'd say the McGill's brother story is ultimately a story of perspective. Jimmy and Chuck had very different ways of viewing life and each other, and those differences blinded them to their similarities. I like how Better Call Saul addresses why the law isn't the only metric for legitimacy and good and bad. The series challenges the idea that anyone is just one or the other, and Chuck hated the idea that you can be both. Good and bad, moral and corrupt, right and wrong, riddled with bad habits and also positive change. And Jimmy was proof you can sincerely be both. But the thing is, Chuck was proof you can be both too. Jimmy was corrupt and compassionate. Chuck was polished and unhinged. You can be both. Jimmy's unruly way of being goes against everything Chuck believed in and built his life on. But the hate Chuck had for his brother was rooted in something even deeper than just Jimmy being so opposite of Chuck and his morals. After going through all of Chuck's scenes, I don't think Chuck hated Jimmy because Jimmy proved him right about how people are forever stuck in their ways. I think Chuck hated Jimmy because Jimmy proved him wrong. And not just about his electricity allergy, and not just about who qualifies as a lawyer, Jimmy proved Chuck wrong about people's ability to change. Jimmy proved you can be both who you were and something new. And for someone like Chuck, someone whose identity is built on being right, on being the one who most understands how the world works, that was unbearable for him. Because if Chuck can be wrong about Jimmy, then what else might he be wrong about? That's the threat Jimmy represented, not only to Chuck's worldview, but to his very identity. Chuck couldn't tolerate not being right. He couldn't stand that his world in which things are black and white was forced to be viewed in color, thanks to the various shades of Jimmy McGill. So yes, Chuck ended up being right about the dishonorable path Jimmy would take. But because Chuck refused to imagine a better version of his little brother, he helped ensure that better version would never exist. Chuck withheld love from his brother because he was consumed with wanting Jimmy to stop being a lawyer, and instead, Jimmy stopped being Jimmy and became Saul Goodman, a manifestation of every bad thing Chuck thought Jimmy would be. I think what the destruction of the McGill brothers most comes down to is not who was definitively right or wrong, but how they chose to see things. And it was hard for Chuck to see his brother and many things clearly when he was so deeply in the dark.